What's going on, Ann Camp? This is Justin Giboney, and this is another civic update where the Ann campaign is trying to raise civic literacy among Christians so that as you go out into the public square, you can engage in a more informed and effective manner. We want to make sure that as you go about your Father's business in the public square, that you can do so in a way that is actually relevant and actually effective. And so that's what these civic updates are about. Today, I want to talk about a little bit about the American low-income housing crisis. This is an issue that Christians should not ignore because it affects the least of these in a very serious way, and we need to get serious about it. But I first want to start off by giving you a little bit of history. So in 1923, America saw its first housing project, and that was a housing project in Milwaukee called Garden Homes. Later in 1935, President Roosevelt and the Public Works Administration created Techwood Homes here in Atlanta. Now, public housing in America really became a thing during the Great Depression. This came along, a lot of it with the Housing Act of 1937. What a lot of people don't realize is that early on, a lot of the housing projects housed a lot of middle-class whites who had fell on hard times during the Great Depression. So even Atlanta's Techwood Homes was white only for a certain period of time. Now, when these people got back on their feet after the Great Depression, a lot of middle-class whites actually ended up moving to the suburbs, and they got a lot of housing opportunities and hope with that. That actually wasn't given to a lot of people of color. So the people of color actually stayed in that area. Later on, we see urban renewal, and what they did with urban renewal is they started really bulldozing what they were calling the slums. And at this period is where we see in some cities the high-rise projects. And so these high-rise projects we saw in cities like Chicago, cities like New York, were supposed to replace the slums. The interesting thing about it is that it didn't really replace the slums. It ended up becoming the slums. High concentrations of poverty, terrible living conditions, along with a lot of other societal issues. We know that that leads to violence. It leads to high crime. It also leads to a lot of stress and drug use and all types of trauma that we still see today in low-income areas. And so this was somewhat of a failed project. Now, if we fast forward to the 2000s, the 2010s, people finally got the message. Look, these projects were a bad idea and people should not be living in these conditions. So Bowen Homes, Bankhead Court, in Atlanta. You also saw it in Cabrini Green's, Robert Taylor Homes in Chicago. And they celebrated it for the same reasons that I talked about, the terrible conditions and understanding that this really wasn't a good situation for any human to live in, so they tear these down. However, the story doesn't end there. So the projects are torn down, but many people would say that the plan to put these low-income people in other stable housing wasn't as solid as it should have been. I know one of the things that happened in Atlanta is that once a lot of the projects were torn down, a lot of the people had to go to places outside of the city. And when they went to places outside of the city, they found that there were less services there. One example is that some people went to places that didn't even have bus service, making it almost impossible to get to where most of the jobs were. We know how many issues that can create. Something else that we saw was that although we know the projects were a very bad situation, one thing it did allow you to do is effectively get services to people. So if I wanted to make sure that the children in the projects who needed it had a breakfast program, I could provide a breakfast program. Or I could provide a summer program to them because I knew where they were. When the projects are torn down, everyone is scattered. And so it's almost impossible to get to these people efficiently to give them the services that they need. And so we see some of the unintended consequences of what could have been some fairly good intentions. And now we get to today. And what we're seeing today is in a lot of America's major cities, low income and even middle class people cannot afford to live in our biggest cities. Go to San Francisco, go to many parts of New York, and you will find that it is way too expensive for low income and even your average American to live there. And that is seriously problematic. That is not the country that we're supposed to be. Now, fortunately, cities like Atlanta still have a short window to make some serious changes to make sure that low-income people and actually middle-income people can still afford to stay in the city. The market is changing quickly, and unless the government acts with some very thoughtful and impactful policy, they'll be in the same situation as you see with bigger cities like New York and San Francisco that I mentioned before. So one of the things that governments have been trying to do is create what they call affordable housing or workforce housing. They'll find a developer, and if the developer will provide a certain number of units, they will give the developer money to provide a certain number of affordable units. And that can be helpful. The problem is it's just not enough. Usually it's not enough units to make up for everything that's being lost. And to tell the truth, a lot of times it's just not affordable, especially for those low income people who would have otherwise been in a project situation. So we have to find some answers. And I don't know that I have all the answers for you, but one of the things that cities must consider doing is using the land that they already own to create low income housing. And that needs to be done very quickly because, as I said, the market is moving quicker and quicker. And this is the kind of issue that Christians need to be very thoughtful about. I hope that you would go on and do your own research to make sure that you understand this very serious low-income housing crisis. Because at the end of the day, if we're going to talk about caring for the poor, caring for the underprivileged, where they're going to stay and what conditions they stay in is a very important conversation to have. If you like this kind of information, as I always say, you should listen to the Church Politics Podcast with me and Michael Ware, where every week we get into conversations just like this. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next week with a civic update.